Imagine your father and brother killed in battle. Their severed heads displayed on spikes above a city gate as a warning to all. Now imagine you are just 18 years old, standing in the snow at the head of tens of thousands of men, fighting the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. For Edward IV, the stakes were simple: win and seize the crown of England, or lose and share the same fate as his king. In 1461, England was 6 years deep into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal fight for the throne between two royal families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. On the Lancastrian side was King Henry VI. He was the reigning king, but he was weak, indecisive, and often struck down by bouts of madness. Running the show for him were a handful of powerful nobles, especially his relatives from the Beaufort family. Opposing him was Richard, Duke of York. Richard felt shut out of power and resented the grip of Henry's favourites had on the crown. Tensions boiled over, alliances hardened, and before long the kingdom was at war. In 1460, Richard's forces captured Henry at the Battle of Northampton. The king in his hands, Richard made his move. He claimed the throne for himself, but even Richard's closest allies weren't ready to throw out the king altogether. Instead, Parliament passed the Act of Accord. It kept Henry on the throne for life, but it declared that Richard and his heirs would inherit the crown after Henry's death. That decision cut out Henry's only son, Prince Edward of Westminster. Queen Margaret, Henry's wife, was furious. She refused to let her son's birthright be stolen. From exile in Scotland, she began raising an army, offering his soldiers the right to plunder as they marched south through England. Meanwhile, other Lancastrian forces were gathering in the north, waiting for her signal. Richard marched out to stop them, but he walked straight into a trap. At the Battle of Wakefield, his army was crushed. Richard and his young son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were killed. Their heads were cut off and displayed on spikes above the gate of York as a warning. With Richard dead, leadership of the Yorkist passed to his eldest son, Edward. After their victory at Wakefield, the Lancastrians were on the move. Margaret's forces joined with the victors and marched south, raiding and plundering towns along the way. At the Second Battle of St. Albans, they defeated the Yorkist army under Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, and freed King Henry VI. But the Lancastrian army's success came at a price. They looted as they went, leaving fear and resentment in their wake. When they reached London, the city refused to let them in, terrified of what might happen if the gates were opened. On top of that, Margaret's army was running low on supplies, no way to properly feed itself. Then came more bad news. Edward, Earl of March, the eldest son of the slain Duke of York, had just won a major victory at Mortimer's Cross. He and his army were now heading straight for London. Margaret knew she couldn't hold the capital, so she pulled her forces back north to York. Edward and Warwick soon marched into London, where the citizens welcomed them with open arms. But there was a problem. They no longer had King Henry in their custody. To keep their cause alive, they needed something bigger. So, on March 4th, Warwick declared Edward as King Edward IV. This time the claim stuck. Many nobles who had resisted Richard of York's bid for the throne now sided with Edward. They saw Margaret's defiance of the accord, the agreement that Richard would succeed Henry, as a betrayal. England suddenly had two kings, Henry VI in the north and Edward IV in the south. It was a situation that couldn't last. Edward moved quickly. He offered ordinary Lancastrian supporters a pardon if they abandoned Henry. The offer didn't extend to the powerful noble families. Edward wanted to weaken them, not forgive them. Then he marched north. The Yorkist army advanced in 3 columns. Warwick's uncle, Lord Fauconberg, went ahead to clear the road to York. Edward himself led the main force, and the Duke of Norfolk gathered men in the east, planning to rejoin them before the final showdown. While Edward pushed the main Yorkist army forward, Warwick's group moved through the Midlands, gathering more men as they marched. On March 28th, the Yorkists reached the shattered remains of the bridge at Ferrybridge. Crossing the River Aire, as they tried to rebuild it, they were suddenly ambushed by 500 Lancastrians led by Lord Clifford. The Yorkists were driven back in chaos. When Edward heard what had happened, he brought up the bulk of his army and launched a direct assault. But the bridge was narrow, forcing his men to fight Clifford's smaller force head-on. The Yorkists had the numbers, but the bottleneck stripped away their advantage. To break the deadlock, Edward sent Lord Fauconberg and his cavalry to cross the river further upstream at Castleford. The ford should have been guarded by Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, but he arrived too late. By then, Fauconberg had already crossed and was racing down at Clifford's flank. The Lancastrians were forced to retreat, but they didn't get far. They were hunted down and wiped out. Lord Clifford himself was struck in the throat by an arrow and killed. The enemy cleared from the area. The Yorkists finally secured Ferrybridge, rebuilt the crossing and pushed on. That night they camped at Sherburn. Just a few miles away, the Lancastrians gathered their army at Tadcaster, north of the village of Towton. At dawn, both sides broke camp under dark skies and fierce winds. It was Palm Sunday, a holy day on the Christian calendar, but there would be no peace. Some records called what followed the Battle of Palm Sunday Field, but most came to know it by another name, the Battle of Towton. The armies that gathered at Towton were massive, some of the largest ever seen in England. Contemporary sources claimed each side had hundreds of thousands of men, but that was almost certainly an exaggeration. Modern historians put the real number closer to 50,000 to 65,000 combined. Still huge. Nearly 2% of the entire population of England at the time. Most of these soldiers were young men in their 20s, hardened veterans, who had already fought in earlier battles of the war. They knew exactly what awaited them. The Lancastrians had a major weakness. Their king, Henry VI, frail in both body and mind, stayed back in York with Queen Margaret. By contrast, the Yorkists had Edward, just 18 years old, tall, confident, and already a commanding figure in full armor. He preferred bold, aggressive tactics, and at Towton he would lead from the front. His presence inspired his men and held them together through what was to be an exhausting and bloody struggle. This wasn't just another battle. Around 3/4 of England's nobility took part at Towton. 8 major lords fought for the Yorkists, while at least 19 sided with the Lancastrians. Not every Yorkist leader made it to the field. Warwick, wounded in the leg at Ferrybridge, was absent. The Duke of Norfolk's forces were present, but under the command of his men, Walter Blount and Robert Horne. Edward relied heavily on Lord Fauconberg, Warwick's uncle. Fauconberg was a seasoned veteran of the Anglo-French wars, with years of experience as captain of the Calais garrison, a commander at Northampton, and even a naval raider in the Channel. His skill would be key to the Yorkist battle plan. On the Lancastrian side, the main general was Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Some credited him with victories at Wakefield and St Albans, though others argued those were really down to Sir Andrew Trollope. Trollope, once trusted Yorkist captain in Calais, had defected to the Lancastrians in 1459 and was regarded as one of the sharpest commanders on the field. The other Lancastrian leaders included Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, the Earl of Northumberland, Lord Cross and Lord Dacre. But one important figure was missing, Lord Clifford, the same man who ambushed the Yorkists at Ferrybridge, had been struck down by an arrow through the throat the day before. The Battle of Towton opened with the Yorkists making their first move. Somerset, commanding the Lancastrians, stayed put on the ridge and let his enemies come to him. But Lord Fauconberg, leading the Yorkist archers, saw an advantage. With the wind and snow at their backs, he ordered his bowmen forward. He unleashed a deadly volley, their arrows flying further than usual and tearing into the Lancastrian ranks. The Lancastrians tried to answer back, but the snow blew straight into their faces. They could barely see their targets. Their arrows fell short, harmlessly sticking in the mud before the Yorkist line. Fauconberg had already pulled his men back, so they took no losses. Blind to their failure, the Lancastrians loosed until the quivers were empty. The field in front of the Yorkists bristled with wasted arrows. That was when Fauconberg struck again. He ordered another volley, and when his men ran dry, they stooped, plucked the enemy's arrows from the ground, and shot them back. Unable to endure it, the Lancastrians surged down the slope, forcing close combat. The Yorkist archers fired the last few volleys before retreating behind the men-at-arms, leaving thousands of arrows on the ground to trip and slow the advance. Edward rode along the Yorkist line where the nobles had gathered. At just 18, Edward IV was already a giant, the tallest king in England's history. Dashing, fearless and bold, he led from the front. He reminded them why they were there, that they had chosen him as their king, that his rights had been stolen, and that the crown was theirs to win back. Then he gave them a choice. If any man had no stomach for the fight, he was free to leave. The answer came back in a roar. The soldiers shouted as one that they would follow Edward to the death if need be. Hearing their pledge, the young king thanked them. Then he leapt down from his horse, drew his sword, and swore that he would live or die at their side. Snow still whipped across the field, blinding the Lancastrians, but they pressed on, confident in their numbers and hungry for revenge. After the hail of arrows, the clash was brutal. Lines of men smashed together in the snow, hacking and stabbing at arm's length. Men screamed. The ground turned slick with blood. For a time the fighting seemed even, but the Lancastrians had more men, and they kept pushing fresh troops into the melee. Slowly the Yorkist army was pushed backwards, step by step, up the southern ridge. Then came a hammer blow from Castle Hill Wood. A Lancastrian cavalry charge slammed into the Yorkist left. That wing buckled, panic spread. Men began to throw their weapons and run. In that desperate moment, Edward himself charged in. The 18-year-old king fought at the front, rallying his men with his sword in hand, shouting them back into line. His presence turned retreat into resistance, and the Yorkists held. For 3 hours the battle raged without decision. Both sides locked in savage combat, the snow turning red, the cold wind carrying cries of the dying. The Yorkists were outnumbered, exhausted, and dangerously close to collapse. And then, through the mist and snow, new banners appeared in the horizon. The standards of Norfolk, His contingent had marched hard up the old London road, unseen until they crested the ridge. To the Lancastrians, it must have been a terrible sight. Fresh Yorkist troops bearing down on their exposed flank. Norfolk's men crashed into the fight, striking the Lancastrian left just as the Yorkists were on the brink of breaking. The momentum shifted in an instant. The Lancastrians fought on bravely, but the weight of the new assault was too much. By the end of the day, their line splintered. Groups of men began to flee. Chroniclers later claimed the combat lasted for 10 bloody hours. A battle of unimaginable endurance that left the snow-covered fields of Towton littered with the dead. As the Lancastrian line finally broke, their retreat turned into a slaughter. Exhausted and desperate men tore off their helmets and armor to run faster, but without protection they were easy prey. Norfolk's troops were fresh and relentless, cutting down the fleeing soldiers as they ran across what later became known as the Bloody Meadow. Many were hacked down from behind, others killed after surrendering. Before the battle, both sides had ordered no quarter, and after 10 hours of brutal fighting, the Yorkists were in no mood for mercy. The rout was even deadlier than the battle itself. Men rushed into the icy waters of Cogbeck, dragging one another under in the crush to escape. Chronicles describe bodies piling up so thick that survivors fled across bridges made of the dead. As for the death toll, medieval chroniclers claim staggering numbers. Some said 28,000, others as many as 38,000. More recent research suggests the real total may have been far lower, closer to 3,000 or 4,000. But even if exaggerated, Towton was remembered as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, a day when Palm Sunday became a vision of hell. When word of the defeat reached him, Henry fled north into exile in Scotland with Margaret and their son. A handful of nobles followed, but Towton had broken the House of Lancaster. Their strongest lords were dead or scattered, their grip on the north destroyed. Edward wasted no time. He declared dozens of Lancastrian nobles traitors, but spared many who bent the knee, preferring loyalty over vengeance. He rewarded his allies with titles, lands, and honors, strengthening his new regime. The crown was his. England had one king, young bold Edward IV, but the Wars of the Roses were far from over. England had a Yorkist king, for now.